The pandemic and its economic fallout have been especially severe for people of color. That also goes for businesses owned by people of color, many of them struggling with restrictions and access to relief. One effort to close the gap is the financial help and expertise offered by the Foundation for Business Equity, especially its COVID-19 Relief Fund. To tell us about some of the results so far is the Foundation's Executive Director, Glynn Lloyd. Thank you very much for joining us again, Glynn.
Glad to be here, Chris.
But I want to talk about what got this foundation started in the first place and how that has been changed by the pandemic.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, it's now a regularly stated stat that came out of the Federal Reserve back in 2015 about this growing wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, net worth of white families versus Black and Latino. And, so folks that took notice. And so we at the Foundation for Business Equity, really alongside initial support from Eastern Bank, said we want to leverage, supporting small business, Black and Latino business owners as a way to mitigate and work towards a greater racial equity.
Well, one of the things that I certainly thought of when I watched your virtual session from last week with business owners is the people they employ. We're talking about a lot of people out there, aren't we?
Yeah, the cohorts that graduated recently, that's 4 and 5 from our, this is about 18 businesses, have close to 1,000 employees. And so, yeah, these are small businesses that employ our local folks. And so that's one of the reasons why we got into the space, which is one of the benefits of us strengthening Black Latino entrepreneurs is they hire from the community.
Well, one of the things I also notice is that even though some of these businesses are in sectors that have been really pushed back by the pandemic and all the restrictions, there are also potentials for growth that they're exploring. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the way to look at this is, I mean, there are some businesses actually that are doing well. And so, grocery, delivery, and those types. And but mostly, Chris, most of them are doing less well, right? So, I mean, from the extreme of really being told to shut down and then come back at a limited capacity to those that are, as you saw on our panel, those who watched it, 15, 20% lower revenues on average. We're starting to see some bit of recovery, but no, you do like consumer home goods and those types of products, you see people actually who've really they've been positioned to do well during COVID.
Well, one of the people in the panel, he was one of the people in charge of a company that specializes in temporary employment. And I can see how the demand is down there, but this is also an important time for them to do things. So how did the foundation help them at this particular juncture?
Well, what we do, Chris, is that we do a couple of things. We really work with the leadership of these companies around advice and strategic advice. And to do that, we actually spend a lot of time. And we start with what we call our strategic advisors who run businesses themselves, who've seen a lot of the patterns that we see as business owners around either marketing or operations. And we really get in there and get a sense of what's happening. And then from there, we decide, okay, what's the priorities? And a lot of times it could be staffing, your own internal staffing. It could be access to capital. It could be access to markets. And so we customize it to what the need is of that company. In his situation, he actually kind of had a bad finance relationship that was costing him a lot of money. And we see this a lot of times in folks who don't have a lot of different options. And so we worked hard at trying to relieve that pressure so that money could go to his bottom line that he was really losing. It was really it's like a factoring company, to be honest with you, of how he was paying, getting his money up front to do for his cash flow, to be specific.
Of course, another area where there was definitely expectations for growth was in the cannabis sector. It barely opened here in Boston for retail business, and all of a sudden the pandemic strikes. But you also got a focus on growth, and you're helping people get ready for that too.
Yeah, I think they were referencing Ardent, which is a great company. They don't touch the cannabis, but it's a home baking unit. We really, I think we work with their leadership to really help build infrastructure around their growing need, because the demand was like increasing because people find themselves in their homes. So yeah, Chris, I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole because, we still have a lot of issues around racial equity with cannabis and a lot of our, we only have really one shop that's up and running that's in our community, the young brothers running that. And so we need to be doing a lot more there.
Well, of course, one sector that a lot of people are readily aware of being hit hard is in the restaurant hospitality sector. One of the businesses you're trying to help here, Daryl's Corner Kitchen and Bar. What about them? Because they're very much focused on not just food and drinks for people, but entertainment, just this whole in-person experience. I mean, it sounds like an impossible situation, and yet you're doing something with them.
Well, Chris, I mean, this actually, I'll be honest with you, it gets me emotional because you had people who, at the turn of the year, were doing everything right. And this industry has completely been disrupted. It's been turned upside down. I mean, you have some of your veteran operators who've basically shut down, right? So the question is how are we going to relate to prepared foods moving forward as customers, consumers, right? I mean, what are we doing right now? And I think a lot of this is just holding on and figuring out what's going to look like on the other side. I think we actually find some of our smaller independent operators, folks who have less of a footprint, smaller spaces, better positioned. And so, Nia's, we mentioned, she's the owner of Daryl's Bar.
Nia Grace, right?
Nia Grace, she's a sharp entrepreneur. So it's tough. We just don't know. We do know that one thing that's been very helpful is free money, right? So we've leveraged as much grant money. Look at the federal government came out with practically a grant program with the PPP. And so we're telling our people take advantage of it all. Mostly with restaurants and others, like make sure you have a good relationship with your landlord because they're a critical partner in this and what their expectations are. And so I think there's paths forward. I mean, people doing more delivery takeout and trying different things. But frankly, Chris, when we sit here today, we just don't know how this is going to turn out. And unfortunately, we're heading into the winter, so this outdoor stuff is no longer going to really be an option, or less so. I shouldn't say completely off the table. And so meanwhile, the pandemic is not getting, it seems like it's getting worse. So it's a challenge for certain sectors.
I know one thing you're helping some of these entrepreneurs with is adaptations to technology. They've got to rely more on e-commerce. In the case of restaurants and takeout, it seems that is also taking a big bite out of them financially. Put on the advocate's hat here a little bit. What about changing that in some way?
I love that question, Chris. Look, I'm getting stats of like Uber Eats and these guys are cutting in 25, 30%, and when you're at low margins already. So we're in conversations with like different groups, like Jen over at the Commonwealth Kitchen, and saying, well, listen, can we start looking at delivery ourselves, right? Can we help solve this issue from a sector point of view? We're early in conversation, but, I do think that there's a structural issue here. And you mentioned, delivery is one of them, but the digital side of it, I think you mentioned too, which is another huge thing. I always like to bring up the example of Amazon, and I'm going to admit on this show today that I actually use Amazon. But look at
who doesn't?
When you think about it, Chris, they were not profitable for years, and they were building their infrastructure. And what was their infrastructure? It was essentially a digital platform. And so we got to think we need to think like this for our small business. Right? And unfortunately, the more successful Amazon is, it hurts our local purveyors. And so I do think that we need to be thinking like you're just saying, really with an advocate hat on, of how we really shift some of the infrastructure and support for these companies in a real meaningful way.
Speaking of support, we have to remind our viewers, I know you mentioned some of the government assistance, but where else is the money coming from, and why is it being put there?
Well, I think it's public now. I think the governor just came out recently with about $50 million in grants for small, they did it by employees. So actually, whenever you're airing this, people need to know that you should go to the Mass Growth Capital's website, because that's where they can find applications, fewer than 5 employees, fewer than 50 employees. So that's free money. So we need more of it. And thank you for listening, Governor, on that. And in the feds, I think there's still conversations around a second round of PPP, right? So something's going to come down, hopefully in the next, when we see this potential transition of administration. But so I do think that, that's the first bucket of money. Foundations have been stepping up as best they can. I know the mayor's office has a fund. I know some of the corporate leaders in this community have really been stepping up to the bar. So we all need to throw in here to support. And then we also, I hate to say, we want to make sure that, you know, the business owners, some folks, you know, maybe it's time to shift, right? So I do think that we want to make sure we're focusing on those that we know can actually do this.
One thing that also surprised me a little bit listening to the virtual session last week is how upbeat these entrepreneurs were. I mean, they were giving themselves high ratings. I know it's self-praise in a way, but I felt there was a real optimism there. Why should they feel that way?
Well, that's the characteristic of an entrepreneur. The glass is always half full. You know, you're the leader of your company. Everyone's looking to you. So as personal experience, you got to put on a good face. But I think they believe it. They believe in themselves. They believe in their products. They believe in their companies. And frankly, you know, the folks on that panel, we know their numbers. We know what they're doing, and they're heading in the right direction. So it actually is backed up by substance. But that's what I love. Why I love my job, Chris. I get to hang out with entrepreneurs who are innovative and who are mostly optimistic.
Well, I know there are some other entrepreneurs out there. Maybe they haven't called you yet. You haven't reached them yet. Is there still a chance that you can get out there and help them? And if so, what should they be doing right now?
Yeah, so yeah, we're open for business in terms of the Foundation for Business Equity. So you go to our website, fbequity.org, and if you're a small business, there's an application process. It's a rolling process. We try to get those that are a little bit, you know, $300,000-$400,000 in revenue and above, and fill it in. And feel free to reach out to me too. To be honest with you, I love talking to you, finding out your story. And we do, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we do this kind of wraparound approach. We meet you where you are at, and try to customize our service to support you and hopefully open up doors for you for the tools that you need to grow. Because one thing, Chris, is it's one thing to be innovative and creative and have a smart product. It's another thing to be black and brown in an entrepreneurial world, right? So we do have, you know, structural bias. And we see it in the numbers in terms of how much loans come our way and equity investments, you know, who we know, what access we have. So what we try to do, Chris, is kind of break down those barriers and level the playing field and try to really open up doors. So at least our entrepreneurs are at the same, you know, on the same level playing field, and they're really, it's about them reaching their full potential.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time and wishing you and the people you're working with lots of success in the future.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
Glynn Lloyd from the Foundation for Business Equity. We'll have more news in just a moment.